In this episode of Plants of the Gods, join ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin as we continue the conversation with journalist, scientific researcher, and filmmaker Hamilton Morris. In the second half of this two-part episode, Dr. Plotkin and Morris discuss synthetic versus organic psychedelics, microdosing, and the magic and future of hallucinogens.
Well, my mentor, Richard Schultes, would often describe mind-altering plants as scalpels in the hand of a shaman. It can heal, but it can also harm if it's not used correctly. And so, once again, all of these plants, all of these fungi, all of these substances need to be used with caution and approached with reverence and carefully. And that's why I often tell people you shouldn't be experimenting on your own with very powerful substances. I also wanted to ask you, Hamilton, about other frogs before we move into a few other topics. And that is, when I was working on a book called Medicine Quest about 30 years ago, I interviewed John Daly. And at that point, 30 years ago, Daly had isolated 40 novel chemicals just from frogs, from 50 different species. So I'm wondering, what's your perspective on frogs and other plants, animals, and fungi as to what's still out there?
I love frogs, and they are amazing chemists. I mean, I imagine you're familiar with epibadidine. It's such a beautiful molecule. And for a terrestrial species to even produce a chlorinated natural product like that is already sort of unusual. Then you have the 7-aza-norbornane ring, which is just bizarre. I mean, the chemistry of it is really, really fascinating. And these frogs and toads are capable of biosynthetic feats that would be very difficult for human chemists. It's remarkable. And I don't doubt that there are amazing things left to be discovered.
Well, I have read recent reports of two venomous frogs found in eastern Brazil, genus Corythromantis and Aparasphenodon, where they have toxins more poisonous than the Bushmaster. And these are recent finds. So the idea that we've kind of got everything from the natural world or even just from the frogs is obviously not the case. Of course, the flip side of that is with chytrid fungi and climate change, these animals which are probably the most sensitive of any group. So the race is on is to find, utilize, and protect these creatures at the same time that we seem to be destroying them faster than ever. There's about 1,000 species of frogs that are known in the Amazon, and we're finding more all the time. But I wanted to turn to one of your idols or mentors or heroes, I don't know how you'd best describe him, Alexander Shulgin, better known as Sasha. And since we're talking about mental states, I wonder if you'd share with us the story about Sasha and the surgery on his thumb.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. And this is a sort of foundational story in psychedelic history because Alexander Shulgin was in the Navy, and when he was in the Navy, he was injured. He injured his thumb, and he was having, I believe, a small surgical procedure, or maybe it was just stitches on his thumb. And the nurse gave him a glass of orange juice that had crystals that he could see present in the juice. And he thought, okay, well, they're giving me morphine in my orange juice. Makes sense. This is going to be, it's a painful procedure. He drank it, and the morphine had this, miraculous analgesic effect. And he thought that was great. That was exactly what I needed. And later he asked the nurse, how much morphine was that in the juice? And she said, oh, no, it was sugar. Those are sugar crystals. So he came to realize that his own mind was capable of producing these sorts of experiences. I mean, this is the placebo effect, and it's very, very powerful. And as somebody who spent his career evaluating completely unknown substances that did not exist in the known universe until they were synthesized in his lab, and he would be the first human being to try those substances, you have to be ultra aware of not just the placebo effect, but also the nocebo effect, the belief that something that is pharmacologically inactive that you have consumed is a poison, because it could go either way. You could take something and suddenly think, oh no, what did I just do? Oh no, this could be some kind of cardiac toxin. I could be dying. You can have both are totally possible, and both are established phenomena in the medical literature. This is not some kind of speculative thing. This is why placebo-controlled trials are done, because the placebo effect is a real effect. This is one of the complicated things about it.
Understood. But we've got two pieces of the puzzle that don't fit together well. Here you have a man who invented more wild mind-altering chemicals than anybody ever had or ever will, and is a big fan of the placebo effect. So what's the lesson we draw from his life and work in terms of the future and healing if we get this right?
Well, I think the first thing is to not always believe your own senses immediately, to scrutinize your own experiences and to try your best to be skeptical and to conduct your work in an evidence-based manner. Because yes, there is nobody who is not vulnerable to the placebo effect. You might think, oh, that's just for the people out there that they're not, really knowledgeable like me. But someone like me, so knowledgeable, I could obviously tell the difference between a placebo and an active substance. Well, the whole issue with placebo is that you can't tell. That's the whole purpose of this effect. And so I think this actually comes back to the conservation issue, because people will say, well, of course, toad venom is different than a synthetic material. And of course, Iboga total alkaloid extract is different from isolated ibogaine. And of course, one variety of psilocybin-containing mushroom is going to be different than another. Well, not so fast. If you're going to make that claim, especially if that claim could have serious ecological consequences, you need to be sure that it's real.
Well, everybody in our field is repeatedly asked or told, I would never take a synthetic, I will only take the natural product. So what's the difference between synthetic mescaline and mescaline?
I love that question, because it's, there's a really beautiful study that was done between two groups of researchers, one in France and the other in Germany. And it was a group of natural product chemists in France who were studying a traditional medicine in Cameroon called Nauclea latifolia. And they knew that this plant had been used to treat pain for generations. So they brought it to the lab, they extracted it, what's in this stuff, and they find that it contains tramadol, which is a completely synthetic pharmaceutical opioid that was thought to have been discovered in Germany in the 1960s. So wait a second. There's now two parallel histories of tramadol, one that is pharmaceutical, starting in Germany, and the other that is a multi-generational traditional medicine history in Central West Africa. And this was kind of a remarkable claim. It was very exciting to me. But then a group of chemists in Germany decided that they were going to try to replicate these findings. They went back to the same region, they started collecting samples, and they found that tramadol was actually distributed throughout the environment. And then the question emerged, okay, so one group is saying this is being biosynthesized by a plant. The other group is saying this is a product of anthropogenic contamination of the environment. And if you're comparing these two samples, what is the difference? How would you ever know? And what it came down to was radiocarbon, because if something is a natural product, it will contain traces of radiocarbon. If something is synthesized from petrochemicals, it will contain no radiocarbon. So in the strictest sense, if you were going to say what is the difference between synthetic mescaline and mescaline biosynthesized by a plant, hypothetically, the biosynthesized mescaline would be slightly more radioactive. But this is not something that would have any health consequence. We're talking about amounts of radioactivity that are barely detectable with the most sensitive known analytical instruments. But effectively, the short answer is nothing. There's nothing different. But again, back to the placebo effect, just because there's nothing different about it doesn't mean that you won't have a different experience. This is why it's so complicated, because this is dependent on your values. So if you're somebody that really likes plants and you have a sort of animist relationship with plants where you see them as having a vital essence of one kind or another, and that is important to you, then you are going to probably have a better experience with plant-derived mescaline because of the associations and the psychological priming associated with that. If you also think that synthetic artificial substances are bad and dangerous and undesirable, you will be inclined to have a negative experience. So it's, again, this is not to say that people don't have different experiences, but that the experience is psychologically mediated as opposed to being mediated by the psychopharmacology of these effectively identical substances.
Which links to another issue that I want to discuss, and that is that of ritual and the role of ritual and the importance of ritual. The best description I was able to find It was ritual is the performance of ceremonial acts prescribed by tradition or sacred decrees. So many of these traditional uses involve a lot of ritual. So what, in your view, is the importance of this ritual in terms of the placebo effect, setting the stage, or convincing you of something that might not happen without it?
There's so many different purposes that a ritual can have depending on the ritual and the plant and what is being done and where it's being done in the culture. But I think that ritual can be very important for emphasizing and accentuating certain dimensions of an experience. So traditionally, Iboga was not used to treat substance abuse disorders in Gabon, but in recent years it is being used that way. And what really struck me was that even without the ceremony being explicitly oriented toward that purpose, I felt that something of that nature was being implicitly communicated, which was a sort of endurance feat where you dance and you fast and you give yourself entirely to this experience. And because you abandon comfort, because you abandon all of your associations in everyday life, it causes you to rely on yourself in a different way. And I think that could have a sort of anti-addictive effect because it's what we refer to as addiction in the substance abuse sense, I think is a ramification of a far more common human tendency, which is a sense of being dependent on anything. It could be your phone. It could be someone that you're in a romantic relationship with. It could be sweet foods. It could be a specific comfortable bed. And you feel that if you don't have that thing, that's necessary for your life. You're not whole without it. You need it. You're dependent on this external force. And I think that ritual emphasizes a certain core independence and a endurance and a feeling that you have so much within you that you can withstand the deprivation of sleep or water because the reserves exist inside you.
Well, again, to drill down a little deeper on this, when I was in Oaxaca 20 years ago, I had the honor and privilege of working with Doña Julieta, who certainly didn't get the press that Maria Sabina did, but the local peoples considered her every bit as powerful. And at one point she told me, she said, before the gringos started showing up here, before people like Wasson showed up here, we used the Niños Santos, the little sainted ones, the mushrooms, to heal and to search for lost objects. That was the two purposes. Very different than what people are going there for now. And so when I hear about people starting to combine cannabis with ayahuasca and things like this and saying it's traditional, what are your thoughts on this sort of combination of these different traditions and these new uses?
It's really actually remarkable. I'm repeatedly surprised by how common that has become. And this is something that's actually not talked about. I'm glad you brought this up because I'll talk to people and they'll say, I just did a combo ceremony with Filimbadusa bicolor. And I'll say, oh, where was it? And I'll say, oh, it was in Brooklyn. And I'll say, okay, what was it like? And they say, they gave me 5 burns. And then as soon as I'd recovered from the vomiting, they gave me Bufo alvarius venom. And I'll say, oh, huh. So they're throwing that in the mix as well. And they'll say, and then when I came down from the Bufo alvarius venom, they gave me Sananga eye drops. And they'll think, wow, all right, they're just really giving you the Whitman sampler.
Quite a buffet.
And that is not uncommon. When I talk to people that are, not a part of an indigenous group, but they've created a sort of, it sounds mean, but, sort of pseudo-traditional, pseudo-indigenous practice where they use pieces of those ceremonies, but they're not actually from those groups themselves. And the way, I know that sounds kind of unsavory the way I just described it, but I think some of these people have good intentions and they're not necessarily harming anyone, but they do tend to mix and match these traditions in a way that is surprising to me. I don't even want to go so far as to say it's necessarily bad, but it's something that I would be very cautious about. And it is I think, cause for concern because they'll do these multi-day, multi-substance retreats where, day 1, you do ayahuasca. Day 2, you do psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Then you do ibogaine. Then you end the whole thing with Bufo alvarius venom. And I don't know. I think your guess is as good as mine when it comes to whether or not that's a constructive practice. I also wanted to ask you one thing really quickly. So you were in Huautla in the early 2000s. I'm curious. So, and Maria Sabina was dead by then. And I'm curious what it was like then.
It was sort of just becoming discovered. And I remember being in the plaza, and there would be people walking through the plaza with Plants of the Gods, the Schultes and Huffman book, going like, I think I'll try that one. Sort of like a Chinese menu. So it was changing at the time.
Tourists were doing this.
Tourists.
Yeah.
Gringos.
Yeah.
But I was working with a Mexican physician who had lived with the Huichols for 8 years and was actually dating the daughter of the most powerful shaman. So I kind of sidled into a very traditional healing tradition rather than being all these guys who showed up in the plaza looking for people saying, mushrooms, mushrooms, hongos, hongos. So it was just at that cusp where things were becoming more commercial and more open to the outside world. And as you know, this type of psychedelic tourism has positive and negative aspects. And that's one of the things I want to ask you about, because you talked about good intentions. And Michael Pollan in his book talks about the fact that a lot of people who are seeking out this psychedelic healing tend to be people with emotional problems who may not be all that together and are the ones most likely to come apart if they're not under the care of really a skilled practitioner who's not in it for the money or just for the money. So I'd like to get your thoughts on this type of psychedelic tourism and the potential downsides and the real downsides that, we see.
Yeah. And this is one of the fundamental changes that occurs in a medical model. If you talk to somebody like William Leonard Picard, who is a very prominent LSD chemist and is considered to have been responsible for producing more LSD than any person in history, and his philosophy when it came to the distribution of LSD was you give it to healthy people. This is not a substance that you give to somebody who just broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. This is not something you give to somebody who's mentally unstable. This is something that is used for the betterment of healthy people. And in a medical model, that is the complete opposite. And instead, these by necessity must be used for treatment of disease, because this is the way our current medical system works. There is no provision for the use of medicines by healthy people. That's not how health insurance works. That's not how the FDA works, for better or worse. And so in these trials and at these retreats, so this occurs on both the gray market, black market, and the medicalized market, there is a tendency for people who are pursuing these things for treatment of disease. And you run the full gamut of problems that can come with that. I think on one end, you have a lot of the sorts of things that happen in the realm of unregulated cancer treatments, where you have desperate people, because a lot of diseases will put somebody in a state of serious desperation. You have a terminal neurodegenerative disease, you want something that will halt that degeneration, and you'll try anything. And if somebody says, hey, Iboga is a treatment for Parkinson's disease, which is a claim that is made quite often, and the evidence for it is not very strong. I've actually talked about this in the past, and is it possible that it could treat Parkinson's? Yeah, I think it's possible, but there certainly isn't sufficient evidence that people who have Parkinson's disease should take Iboga thinking that this is going to cure all of their problems. I mean, it really has not been adequately studied. So you have that sort of thing happening. And then you have the problems with aftercare, with integration, where if somebody has some kind of trauma and they have this experience at, let's say, a toad venom retreat, then what? Is there a follow-up? No. Then they're on their own. And we don't live in a society that has provisions for caring for people after an experience like that, which can be really disruptive to their functioning.
I think this integration issue is much overlooked in our field. My organization, the Amazon Conservation Team, does a lot of work with the original ayahuasqueros in the Northwest Amazon that Schultes work with in the 40s. And many times you'll finish a ceremony and 3 days later you're walking down the street and you'll get some realization, or you have some weird sort of semi-vision. And you're able to go back to the shaman and say, well, what does that mean? And they'll be able to explain it to you usually. But in our culture where you go to the doctor and then you're done, what happens afterwards, it's your issue, your problem. And these powerful substances in our heads, our minds, and our souls, if you don't have somebody there guiding you through the aftermath, I think you're kind of asking for trouble. And I think, again, this is one of the reasons why their medicine is effective in some cases when ours is not.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if you think that fungi are as promising as frogs in terms of new substances, new mind-altering substances, new stuff for microdosing. What's your perspective?
Well, from a sustainability perspective, mushrooms are about as good as anything anyone could ask for. And a lot of that has to do with the natural abundance of proliferation of different species and different genera that produce psilocybin. And that is a product of people being obsessed with mushrooms and searching for them everywhere, because this wasn't always the case. You know, there was a time when people thought this was exclusively something that was found in Oaxaca, and if you wanted to try psilocybin-containing mushrooms, you had to go to Huautla. And it wasn't until people started finding them in the United States, and more importantly, until Dennis McKenna adapted laboratory techniques for the cultivation of psilocybin-containing mushrooms and published it in an underground, non-scientific guide intended for lay readers, that not only did people recognize that these things grew naturally in the United States, but that they could cultivate them themselves. And that really sparked a revolution that dramatically increased the availability of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. They went from something so obscure that essentially nobody could try them to the most common psychedelic. And that was exclusively a product of innovation, really scientific innovation and cultivation techniques. And I think that is why it's so important to think about these things. If people hadn't done that, it could have been very different. It could have been even more overcrowding in tourism to Mexico if people thought that by necessity they had to make this voyage. And instead it had an effect where people were empowered to pursue these things independently, which I think can be a very positive thing. And the issue is that we just haven't developed equivalent techniques for a lot of these other things. That was sort of what I was trying to do with 5-MeO-DMT. It's a little more complicated, but if there were a way to empower people to use these things sustainably, then a lot of these problems would go away.
Excellent point. I mean, we send ethnobotanists to the jungle searching for magic frogs, and it turns out here they are in Arizona. Richard Schultes left Massachusetts to the wilds of Oaxaca in 1936 in search of magic mushrooms, but according to Juliana Furci, who was on Tim Ferriss's show recently, there's probably 12 or 15 magic mushroom species growing in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So on one hand, it's a bit like the Wizard of Oz. There's no place like home. But I think that what it brings home is that all species everywhere are valuable and need to be investigated. So where do we look next for these new and wild substances? Is it the coral reef? Is it the boreal forest? You're the natural product chemist. What do you think?
Well, I don't actually do all that much work with natural products. Almost everything that I do is synthesis of novel compounds, although I've done a little bit. I've synthesized 5-bromo-DMT, for example, which is the only psychedelic that has ever been isolated from a marine organism. And it's really the only known psychedelic from the ocean and only the ocean. I think it is possible that there will be other marine psychedelics discovered, but again, the same problems emerge. I mean, thankfully, people don't really like 5-bromo-DMT that much and also thankfully, it's easy enough to synthesize that nobody has considered attempting to poach the sponge source, Menospongia aurea. But what if that were not the case? What if it were like 5-MeO-DMT and it produced a really remarkable, life-changing type experience, and that would rapidly become a conservation issue, and you'd probably run into the same phenomenon where some shaman or zealot would say, well, look, I found an ancient engraving of a sponge, and this shows that, in fact, people have been using sponges for thousands of years, and it is our ancestral responsibility to remove these sponges from the ocean and figure out a way to smoke their alkaloids.
I think it's going to present a more challenging case for these neo-shamans to claim that it was always used as a hallucinogenic by the indigenous peoples who lived on the coral reef, but time will tell. Now, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to share on the preponderance of hallucinogenic substances in the New World and the New World tropics versus the Old World. A lot of people have paid a lot of lip service to this, and I haven't heard a convincing case as to why we have so much from Central and South America and relatively so little from Africa or Asia.
I think one answer seems to be that people have not looked as hard. I mean, people are finding new species of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. There was a species found in Congo not so long ago that, just it seems very possible to me that nobody had looked until somewhat recently. There was even evidence of traditional use of psilocybin-containing mushrooms in Uganda, which would be really interesting because that would suggest that there was maybe a parallel evolution of psilocybin-containing mushroom traditions in both Africa and in Mexico. The evidence for the use in Uganda is relatively slim, but there is one paper on it that suggests that this could be the case.
Well, if you get me that reference, put it in the show notes because I'm sure that'll be of great interest to a lot of people. Now, Weston LaBarre, who was on Schulte's early expeditions to Oklahoma in search of peyote, wrote a classic paper on the shamanic origins of religion and medicine. And I'm wondering if you have a personal opinion or insight as to whether these disciplines were essentially the same or how much overlap there was thousands, tens of thousands, or maybe 100,000 years ago.
Oh, well, certainly, traditionally, there would have been an enormous amount of overlap, depending on what culture you're talking about as well. And I think that this is one of the things about modern medicine that has been lost is these sort of ceremonial or ritual or psychological dimensions to the administration of a medicine, which will necessarily change the outcome. I mean, they've even done experiments with a treatment for hair loss called finasteride, and they gave one group of people information where they said, this drug, it's going to cause sexual dysfunction, it's going to cause depression, it's going to have some negative side effects. And the other group, they didn't say any of this. And the people who'd been told that there was risk of these adverse effects experienced them more prominently. So there's no question that the way a medicine is administered changes the outcome. And that's something that is not really integrated into our current medical practices.
You have talked about the importance of strychnos and strychnine in medicine. In Suriname, where I've done a lot of my work, they have long sold a male aphrodisiac tea made from a species of strychnos. Now, I don't know whether there's strychnos in it, and I'm not advocating the use of strychnos, but I wonder if you could elaborate on this use of poisons as medicines and vice versa.
Have you ever tried it?
I have not tried it.
Yes. But strychnine was used as a medicine. It was actually used as a performance-enhancing drug by athletes. Whether or not that is really effective for that purpose is unclear to me. Obviously, it's potentially very unsafe. But I think strychnine is a really good example of this, foundational concept in toxicology, which is the dose makes the poison. There is nothing that is inherently therapeutic or inherently toxic. These are all a function of dose. So there is a dose of strychnine that is not dangerous to consume. It's a very low dose. The therapeutic index of strychnine is quite a bit lower than other substances, but that doesn't mean that it is intrinsically a poison. Almost everything that we call a poison under some circumstances, at least conceivably, could have a therapeutic effect, including radiation. So, So in terms of strychnine use, I've always been curious about it because one thing that I've learned over the years is almost any time somebody classifies a substance as really, really bad or extremely dangerous, it tends to be the case that it's at least partially misunderstood. And it wouldn't surprise me all that much if maybe a very, very low dose of strychnine did elicit some kind of desirable effect. But obviously, I am not suggesting anyone listening to this go out and try to evaluate that on their own.
Agreed. We're not advocating for the use of poisons to see what the therapeutic dosage. I'm interested in the case of Salvia. We talked about medicinal plants before we knew much about medicinal fungi. And then Wasson comes back from Oaxaca with a medicinal mint. This was stunning to the chemical world, to the ethnobotanical world, and I wonder what you think that tells us about what's still out there waiting to be discovered.
Yeah, I love the story of Salvia because it was studied by no shortage of brilliant researchers. This was Albert Hofmann, who had little trouble isolating and then synthesizing psilocin and psilocybin. He obviously synthesized LSD. He did very complicated work with ergolines. And yet, when he was given a sample of Salvia divinorum, he couldn't figure it out. And that was the case for many people for many years. They would make extracts of it. They would inject that extract into a cat. There's a Mexican psychiatrist named Jose Luis Diaz who did that work, and it was clear that it was having an effect on animals. Humans tried it. It was also seemed clear it was having an effect, but the effect was somewhat subtle. And part of this had to do with the way that it was administered, usually as an aqueous infusion. Wasson tried it, Hoffman tried it. They said that there was some effect, that it was sort of mushroom-like, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. And people were trying to figure out, what is this stuff? What does it do? If you extract it, inject it into a cat, it does something, it has a subtle effect in humans. What chemical is responsible for this? There's no nitrogenous alkaloid in it that's responsible. So what's going on here? And I was actually talking to Dennis McKenna on my podcast recently, and he told me a really funny anecdote where he was working for Shaman Pharmaceuticals, and he was studying extracts of Salvia and looking at their affinity for the kappa opioid receptor. And it was off the charts, and he thought, okay, this doesn't make any sense. There's no way that this plant contains something this potent. I must have made a mistake. So he actually discovered this, but then discounted his own finding because it seemed too extraordinary to be real. And it wasn't until Brian Roth actually started working with another citizen scientist named Daniel Siebert that they were able to definitively demonstrate that the active principle of Salvia divinorum was salvinorin A, and that salvinorin A was an extraordinarily potent and selective agonist for the kappa opioid receptor, and that it was the most potent naturally occurring psychedelic. So that is quite a curveball coming from a plant that there was some ambiguity whether it was active at all.
Well, when I was in Oaxaca and asked the shaman about it, she said, I'm not going to give it to you. It's too strong and you don't need it. And eventually she changed her mind, but it was really very unpleasant. And I didn't feel a healing result from it. But now that it's obtained such wide popularity, I have to say I remain very surprised. But it clearly is not similar to many of the other mind-altering substances that I've had experiences with.
Did you chew the leaves or use an aqueous infusion?
No, it was the leaves.
Yeah.
So that's how she administered. She said she didn't use it much because it was so powerful, and it was like sort of a last ditch or very serious cases. Whereas, as you point out, that these shamans often give you medicines when you're not sick, what we'd probably call adaptogens or immunostimulants, which 20 years ago weren't words that were in common parlance. But I was just struck by how different it was and how unpleasant it was, frankly.
And what was it that you didn't like?
I felt that I was underwater in the dark for 9 hours. I didn't feel a sort of healing therapeutic effect. It just was almost like a punishment. So, but I mean, shamans will tell you, if you want a light show, go to Disneyland, okay? If you take ayahuasca and you don't see anything, it doesn't mean it's not working. That the bejuco, the remedio, is giving you what you need. And sometimes you see the ninth dimension, and sometimes you just fall asleep, but you're getting out of it what you need. The plant knows. That's what they say. So again, I can't say that I was disappointed because I didn't see fireworks. I mean, I'm not a person who is seeking thrills this way. It's just that, many times we've all had experiences with these substances where we felt better for it, or felt relief or stressed or whatever, and sometimes you don't, and sometimes maybe you feel a little worse off. Kind of how I felt.
Yeah.
So anyway, I want to wind up here, but since you brought up our friend Dennis McKenna is organizing a conference which will discuss, among other things, the Stoned Ape Theory, first promulgated by his late brother Terence. And at the same time, we have people who are putting forward the drunken monkey theory. And I wonder what you think of these ideas that these mind-altering substances may have played a fundamental role in not only human culture, but human evolution. The Stoned Ape Theory, which was put forward by Terence McKenna, is, of course, stating that once we discovered mushrooms or whatever mind-altering substances, it created consciousness, and we began to wonder. It wasn't just about what's to eat or what plant do I use when I get sick. The drunken monkey theory is that our ancestors lived in the trees, and the ripest fruit would fall to the ground, which is the sweetest fruit, which in some cases is fermented fruit. So they were catching a buzz from alcohol. And so these are sort of presented as different cases, but they kind of point in the same direction. And so we can just talk about the Stoned Ape Theory as to whether mind-altering substances really played a fundamental role, or may have played a fundamental role, or may have played no role in the evolution of consciousness, culture, history, and evolution.
Well, evolutionarily, I think the evidence for that is pretty slim to non-existent. And I think that Terence McKenna is sometimes taken too literally. You know, I think of him as a poet. I love everything that he says, and I think that a lot of the things that he said were intended to provoke people, to cause them to really think about these things and to value them. And I think that in that capacity, he was extraordinarily effective. But from an evolutionary biological perspective, that would not be my first explanation for how consciousness emerged in humans. That said, I think that if today in our culture, with all of the distractions and all of the things that exist, we can still look to this experience and see it as one of the most momentous and amazing in an entire life, you think, well, what would that have been like if you didn't have all of these distractions? If it's this valuable to us now, what would it have been like in the past? And if it allows people to have religious epiphanies and even start religions now, then what would it have been like in the past? And I think that it's reasonable to assume that it might have been similar. That said, I think that people get into trouble when they, try to explain everything with psychedelics, which is the extreme that people tend to go to. They either want to, again, back to these polarizing dichotomies, either psychedelics are purposeless and have no historical value, or they're the origin of consciousness, religion, and everything else. And I don't doubt that they did play a role in some ancient religions, but the question is how significant that role was. And yeah.
So I want to thank you for your kindness and your insights. It's a pleasure to listen to somebody so well-spoken. But I want to conclude by asking you about your mentor, Nicholas Langlitz, and the primatology of primatologists.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Nicholas Langlitz is a really brilliant medical doctor who then became an anthropologist. And he wrote a book called Neuropsychedelia, which I really admire, which is a anthropological analysis of neuroscientific research on psychedelics. And he's really great at taking a different perspective on these issues and really asking questions about what are the motivations for these people, why are they doing it, what biases are integrated into the work they do. And he then switched to doing a sort of meta-primatology analysis where he'd look at the primatology of primatologists, which I thought was also really interesting. But I think he might get back into psychedelics right now, because when he wrote Neuropsychedelia, this was somewhat of a fringe issue. He was spending time with the dozen or so researchers that were doing this work, like Franz Vollenweider. But now it's hard for somebody to keep track of it, even if it's their full-time job. I mean, by some estimates, there are hundreds of pharmaceutical startups that are pursuing these things therapeutically. I am repeatedly amazed by the proliferation of new scientific papers and patents coming out on psychedelics. I mean, this is really expanding at a pace that has never before been seen. I mean, only rivaled by the 1960s. And so it's good that there are people carefully monitoring what's happening, because it's an important time in history.
Last question. TimothyLearys Legacy, from your perspective.
Well, like McKenna, I think that Leary is somebody who's often misunderstood and possibly taken too literally. I see Leary as a comedian, and a very good one at that. I mean, when I read his books, when I listen to him speak, I am repeatedly struck by how hilarious he is. And I think that he was blamed for a lot of the problems that emerged in relation to psychedelic drug use, because people would say, okay, everything was going right, this was all going to be a medicine, and then Timothy Leary came along, and this zealot wanted to go on some kind of ego crusade to create a counterculture that would delegitimize psychedelics. And I think that's a really uncharitable interpretation of what was going on. I mean, I think that the history of psychedelics had been profoundly elitist, and Timothy Leary was somebody who wanted to break with that tradition of elitism, and he wanted to say, this experience was good for me, And I think it's going to be good for you as well. I have no reason to say that this isn't going to be good for you. So in fact, go for it. Is that the most responsible thing to have done? Probably not. But I think that there was something honest about it and something democratic about it and something that actually put faith in the intelligence of the broader community, whether or not that was a good or bad idea. And if it hadn't been him, it would have been somebody else. I think that's the other thing to keep in mind with all of this. Hiding is a great short-term strategy, and it's a terrible long-term strategy. And if people think that these problems are going to be solved by hiding or being silent, it's just not the case. Maybe for one person, for one generation, you can hide. But if you want to see progress in the long run, you have to be open. You have to be honest. And ultimately, what Timothy Leary did in the long term is the right thing, because he was honest about what he felt about these things. He thought they were amazing. He wasn't going to hide that and say, oh, no, this is only for medical use, because he didn't believe that. And I think that the same is true for these conservation issues. I remember somebody criticizing me and saying, well, don't you realize that by even talking about toad conservation, you're simply informing more people about toads. So what you really should do is just not talk about it. And again, that might be true if I were the only person talking about it. But people are going to talk about it whether I like it or not. And so the question is, are you going to talk about it responsibly?
Agreed. Thank you very much. This is great.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team.